Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy the story. This was written by a real human. So please leave a like if you enjoy it to help the channel and subscribe for future content. It's free. Links to the story and Patreon will be in the description. Please go and support the author. Any support is always appreciated. If a human narrator would like to narrate my stories, please contact me. I write these in my spare time between work and my children and just don't have the time or quiet space to narrate them myself. I hope you can understand. Thanks for your time, and again I hope you enjoy the story. And for the love of everything YouTube, this is literature, so please leave my channel alone. Let's get into it, folks. Lori watched as her shuttle docked with Luna 1, the first of 3 habitable rings built by the humans around their moon. She was anxious as she stood with Tim's mother and their children. Tim's mother, Gina, had been a saint sent by Halleck during the last 2 months. The babies loved her. And to be honest with herself, Lori had to admit she hadn't had a clue as to what to expect. Oh, there had been articles she had been sent by the doctors for her and Tim to read. Still, nothing prepared them for those first couple weeks home. It had gotten better though. With Gina's help, they had managed to adapt to the new chaos of parenthood. Tim had grudgingly agreed to let Gina introduce her and the kids to his father Phil. Tim had gone back on ship duties a week prior and she missed him already. She looked down at Thera, asleep in her arms, and then back at the stroller Gina stood behind with Thomas and Laura. She smiled at Gina as she gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Everything will be fine, dear," Gina said as their shuttle door opened with a hiss as pressure equalized with the outside habitat. As she stepped out, she couldn't help but gawk at the enormous rings circling slowly to generate localized gravity and produce power for their habitat's atmospheric shields. Massive buildings dotted the skyline and walkways meandered through lush gardens. The moon, visible right above them from her current perspective, looked like she could reach out and touch the massive cities and spaceports dotting its light green surface. She found herself thinking about her people's plight, and finding what seemed to most Orions now like a second home. They still mourned their losses and collectively had determined to accept the hand given to them. Halleck taught that everything happens for a reason. Her people had been welcomed as full United Sol Alliance members. Regent Tara and President Allen had managed to push the bill through the Senate even with strong opposition. Apparently, certain senators didn't like the fact President Allen had given someone an Orion battlecruiser but were too worried about the negative publicity if they didn't back the Orions joining the U.S. Alliance. "This way, dear," said Gina as she started down a path leading into a massive housing unit. It was fully as big as the entire Frim habitat. One building. She took in everything, knowing it may be a long time before she could visit the lunar rings again. Earth she was scheduled to visit next week with Regent Tara on a business trip to somewhere called Australia to secure the construction of a shipping freighter for their new home. Last week she managed to get 3 old but still functional asteroid mining rigs leased at almost no cost for, as long as the Orions wanted to work them, as well as the mineral rights to a small section of the asteroid belt. Lori had personally called about the zero-G furnaces they would need. That had been an eye-opening experience, learning about smelting ores and purifying alloys. And expensive. That's part of why Frim needed a bulk freighter to start trade with the other U.S. Alliance members. They walked for a good hour or so, and Lori began to get tired and the babies began to stir. They hadn't started fussing yet, but Lori knew they would be needing to be fed and their butts checked very soon. They traveled up to another landing, probably the 7th one, and Gine stopped and took a drink from a water bottle and handed Lori one as well. A human couple walked by, heading down, both giving her a curious look before continuing down to the next lowest landing. They rested for a moment at a convenient bench and Lori couldn't help but be fascinated by the sheer amount of productivity the humans seemed to effortlessly accomplish as she watched large freighters heading for Mars and various other places within the Sol system. "How do you do it?" she suddenly asked, gesturing with her free hand at the multitude of ships and people moving about busy with this or that. Gina had been in mid-sentence explaining about the lower cost of living on Earth or Mars than the lunar rings. "What do you mean, dear?" She looked around, a puzzled look on her face. "Work?" Lori shook her head and said, "No, it's not work, we all work. No, it's the sheer magnitude of it and the amount. Like this ring we're sitting on right now, how do you do it? I know it wasn't as easy as, hey, let's build this. We had big projects back home, such as the Sky Cities. They took nearly 1,000 standard years to build." She then pointed at another 4th ring still being constructed below them. "How can you afford all this? Build all this? And so quickly too. This is my 3rd time this close to your cradle in less than a standard year, and I'll swear on my mother's milk that thing's nearly finished." She slowly shook her head. Regent Tara had given her a very simple task. Figure out how the humans, and in effect, the United Sol Alliance, were able to do all these projects and maintain their economy and the general happiness of its citizens. If their government at the peak of its power and influence had tried to terraform a moon, they would have probably stopped trying after the interest waned. Not the humans, regardless, and for whatever reason, once committed to something, seemed to follow through with it. Gina seemed to think for a moment before replying. I'd probably say capitalism. She shrugged. Everyone likes to make money. Lori just stared at her for a moment. Capitalism? Yep, the best answer I can give you, dear. We adopted it pretty early on after our unification. Although several Earth governments had the same type of system. I'm not a historian or anything, but I'm sure you can look it up on the Galnet. She gave Lori a grin as she stood back up. Alright, we're almost there. Ready? Yeah, you're serious, just capitalism? Lori asked. It couldn't be that easy. She stood and shifted Thera before they started again. But I know several systems still practice other forms. And they still seem to be prospering. Yep, that's because if you agree to be a part of the U.S. Alliance, you sign the Free Trade Charter. This means any Alliance merchant can trade anywhere in Alliance territory. If a system's government decides not to abide by the law, then they will shortly be hurting for produce, as merchants talk a lot. Especially about systems costing them money. She looked over at Lori. I'm not an expert though, dear. They walked a little farther talking about this and that, and Lori found herself rather enjoying the conversation with Gina. It had somehow gotten on the subject of Tim's childhood as they reached the last landing and continued towards a rather large building with very few windows. On the front of it was mounted a sign that read, Astrolabs. An armed guard stood at the door as they made their way up to it. He acknowledged them, asked their business, and after Gina produced a key card and allowed him to swipe it, he let them through with a smile, adding, Tell Phil I'll have his case of bourbon by the end of the week. And let him know we'll have to move poker night up to 8. Randy in genetics has an appointment with Sapient Resources that's probably going to run late. Will do, George. How's Carla and the kids? Asked Gina. Lori picked up on the turn to casualness. She had started to tense up and become anxious seeing the security. They're doing great. Casey just started her 6 years of service. Jerry's off to survival camp with the rest of his class on Babylon. And if you'll show up, you can talk to Carla at the barbecue next week. George continued to walk with them to the lift, still chatting with an easy grin on his blocky face. She's back on Europa at the moment. Something important, by the way. She dodges my questions. He chuckled a little. Well, I do hope you ladies have a great day. He tipped his black-brimmed red hat with a large L on the front and headed back to where he had been standing when they had walked through the first door. The hallway that the lift opened up into led to a lobby where Gina asked the receptionist something as Lori settled down to start feeding the kids. As Gina came over and gently took Thera, who had finished her bottle and was growling playfully. That allowed Lori to take Laura, who had just woken up and started to fuss. This way, please, called the receptionist after several minutes. The children had settled back down, and in just a few moments they were following her farther into the building and to a room marked Visitation. Lori wondered at that, but had been told that Phil was a high-level bioengineer who worked on weapons. So she assumed it had to do with safety precautions. Sitting at a table in the center of the room was a picture of what she would imagine Tim would look like, with gray hair and a set of bifocals, one lens visibly running numbers and figures as he smiled. Gina, dear, you know I'm busy. What is so important? He looked at Lori and back to Gina. I have 1 more week of research in isolation testing protocols and I can have my year off, and we can take that trip to the Cillian Moon resort you wanted. He looked back at Lori, his eyes squinting as he studied her. An Orion, if I'm not mistaken? Who's she? Gina let out an exasperated sigh as she said, If you would answer your messages you would know. This is why Tim doesn't come to our family gatherings, Phil. She took a breath, and Lori could see a vein starting to pop out on her forehead. She was visibly angry. And Lori suddenly felt like she was in the middle of something she hadn't prepared for or expected. And that's when Thomas started to fuss. Phil rubbed the back of his head and looked genuinely apologetic at his ignorance, as she handed Laura to Gina and took Thomas out of the stroller. As Gina began to grow red with anger, Lori's brain finally kicked in. She stepped forward, positioning her son on her hip, and stuck out her hand in the traditional human greeting and said, Hello, Phil, we've been looking forward to meeting you. He hesitantly took her hand, glancing at Gina, who had turned her attention to Laura temporarily. This is Thomas, that's Laura, and Thera in the stroller seems to have fallen back to sleep. Yeah, but I don't. He began, but Gina cut him off. Your grandchildren, she said. And Phil looked like he had been hit with a boulder. He just held onto her hand limply for a moment before his entire demeanor seemed to change in an instant. You mean to tell me he's finally committed to something other than his damn career? As Gina nodded, a warm broad smile came across his stubble-covered face. Can I hold him? Thomas was fussing still, but Lori nodded, releasing Phil's hand and gently handing him over. Phil took his grandson, gently, and as he tucked him into his chest he started to bounce slightly and within a couple of heartbeats went quiet in his grandsire's hands. Private Jackson paced back and forth, anxiety bleeding out of his tense muscles. He had been pushing himself a little harder in the physical therapy sessions Dr. Carla had assigned. He looked at the clock, 3:37. He chastised himself for looking at it for the 50th time. Instead, he walked over to the makeshift crib nest his children slept in and gently pulled the thin silk sheet their mother had made for them a little higher over Chaos, and eased Roger's bottle back into his mouth. Emma and Zane slept soundly. Over the last 2 months they had grown exponentially. Their diets had also started changing. They had begun to consume more human foods. In fact, the bottle Rogers had contained human infant formula and added proteins. He glanced at the window on the other side of his room and could see Zava moving restlessly in her sleep. He closed his eyes and focused on her. After a moment he started catching ghostly images, actual psychic images Zava's mind was manifesting into a nightmare. He could see the images form into other viril as they began to attack her, mercilessly. He winced as he felt her getting stabbed again and again by her kind as they spat and kicked at her and called her a gagta, which translated roughly to abomination. He looked back at his children and was thankful that whatever link he shared with their mother didn't seem to affect them. Zava had explained that they easily picked up the blocking technique that he was still working on mastering. He grinned as he thought about how easy seeing what she was thinking was becoming to him. May I speak with you? Zava asked, her tone worried. You can't sleep either? He asked, knowing full well she was just having a nightmare. Yeah, sure, let's talk. He caught himself turning to look at the clock and stopped as he slowly turned back to her. Bad dreams? She stood up and let the sheet drape across her lower torso as she walked to the window. The door had been unlocked now for several weeks between their 2 rooms, but neither of them had entered the others. He hadn't even realized when he had noticed it. She looked at their children and after a moment back to him. Such a peculiar thing, these dreams. And you say you have them all the time? She asked as he nodded. He could see her shiver. It's like reliving an event over and over. It's horrible. Zava said, and he knew she meant it. It's not so bad. Sometimes they can be good. He trailed off with a shrug. You're worried about something, Jack, and it's bleeding through the link very strongly. She paused for a moment, then deadpanned, Wait, you're worried about me? Why do you seem like you're dreading tomorrow worse than I am? That caught him off guard. He was quiet for a few moments, both in his head and verbally. He wasn't quite sure he was actually ready for her meeting with General Burns. Aren't you? He replied. He figured she would be the nervous one. She had volunteered to have her nanites base code altered to effectively turn a portion of them into a fucking bomb. She hadn't had to do it, but she knew he wanted to get off this moon. Europa wasn't a place he wanted to raise his children, or ever visit again if he could help it. You're afraid. She suddenly went very still, and he noticed something changed instantly between them. He couldn't pinpoint what exactly, but he caught a flash of something in his mind that had him puzzled. He had felt it before but couldn't name it. Of course I am. If something happens to you, I'm most likely fucking dead. And our children probably won't survive the psychic shock. He waved his hand towards the cradle nest. What father wouldn't be? I still can't believe you asked for the procedure. And nobody could tell him she didn't have ulterior motives. She started laughing. Mentally, he could not only hear but feel her laughter. After a few moments, she regained control of herself. I've tried to explain to you several times. This connection we have is wrong to us. I am as good as dead to my people. So will our children be if they can manage it. She looked at their children and back to him. I tried to hide it from them. But after you collapsed and I was frantically worried about you, they knew, somehow. She had nearly died when he had that stroke in the lift after their first real visit. It had ended up being caused by the optical implant that controlled his synthetic eye. Thankfully, Felix and Specialist Talk had quickly identified the faulty pathways and his nanites were able to repair them fully. It had only been a day after he had finally recovered that she had been attacked during exercise time. He could still feel everywhere she had been stabbed. He had been frantic to get help to her. He shook his head, not wanting to dredge up that particular memory. Instead, he said quietly, "But why? There had to be something else. I intend on offering to help your Navy by divulging our tactics, numbers, and as much technical knowledge as I can remember. Willingly and without any malicious intent. she answered. So, information gathering then, he mused. He could guarantee she would be trying to learn everything she could about the United Sol Alliance Navy. And he knew several ways of shutting down or freezing your nanites if you needed to. I won't though. She looked over at their children, sleeping blissfully, unaware of the world, and slowly back to him. I have nothing but our children and a link to a man I find more intriguing every day. No one would help me if I were to try. And my own people wouldn't believe me now if I sent them the codes controlling every U.S. Alliance ship in your fleet. She paused, looking right into his eyes with her deep lavender pupils. My place is now only with my children and their father. Our nest must grow strong to survive. Nothing else matters. I must show my worth to those who would allow me a chance. And eventually, I might even see you forgive me, or at least trust me. She placed a hand on the glass and closed her eyes. Whatever it takes for our nest. He looked at her, using everything he had learned so far to read her. All he could sense was her sincerity. He let out a sigh and shrugged again, stifled a yawn with the back of his hand and said, Well, 7 o'clock comes around pretty quick. We better try to get some sleep while we can. Good night, Zava. Good night, Jack. She replied. He could sense her watching him as he got into his bed and settled in. One thing was certain. A lot of things would be different for him and his children very soon. Thanks for listening. Please leave a like and hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed the story. If you feel generous and want to support the author's work, go visit the Patreon link in the description. Any support is welcome. Until next time.